Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Iran may have not initiated the April round of hostilities with Israel, which started with the assassination of its IRGC Quds Force officers in Damascus. But Tehran responded with an outsized attack, and though it was blocked by Israel, with a little help by its friends, there is a danger of its feeling cocky enough now to risk a breakout towards nuclear weapons. Is that a real option? Or will Iran now be deterred from provoking an all-out Israeli offensive on its nuclear facilities? With us to analyze it, all the way from New York City, is Dr. Olli Heinonen, formerly the International Atomic Energy Agency's Deputy Director General, and currently a Distinguished Fellow at Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. It's good to see you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure indeed. Also turning to Central Israel, where we're joined by Dr. Uzi Arad, formerly an Israeli National Security Advisor and a Mossad Division Chief. It's also good to see you, sir.
Hello, good to see you.
Let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. It's a pleasure as always. Set the stage for us, please.
Well, as we all know, for the last couple of decades, there has been a war between Israel and Iran. Most of the time, it was sub-conventional. It was done by subterfuge, by subversion, by assassinations, and other black arts. Now, for the very first time, it has gone up a level to the conventional arena. For the first time, Iran has launched hundreds of projectiles of various sorts, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, at Israel. Israel, up to now, has only been a passive participant in this new round by absorbing and deflecting the offensive. And the question is Iran going to notch up the campaign to the next and ultimate level, that is the unconventional, maybe it should be called super conventional level of going nuclear? It has, for several years now, accumulated material. As far as is known, and the US intelligence community is very blatant about it, no decision has been made to break out for nuclear warheads. But one must be concerned because of this new escalation, even though perhaps there will be second thoughts in Tehran now that its vaunted arsenal of missiles has failed so miserably. And obviously, once it has a warhead, even though it can also have an airplane-carried bomb, most of the warheads being weaponized are supposed to be the tip of the missile. And if missiles are so easily intercepted, what's the point?
Indeed. Well, following the strike on Israel, we heard Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant come out and state that the fact that those ballistic missiles were launched, we can only imagine what would happen if one or two of those projectiles would carry a nuclear payload, something that, of course, demands an international coalition, as he put it, to confront the Iranian nuclear threat. And subsequently, we heard also IAEA Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi come out following a Security Council meeting and voicing concern, acknowledging concern about prospects of targeting a Iran's nuclear program specifically, which may, of course, have devastating consequences for the Islamic Republic at this stage. Dr. Olli Heinonen, when we look at the Iranian calculus in this whole story and the process towards enough accumulated materials and the backup of technologies in order to formulate its aspirations of attaining nuclear weapons, can one expect Iran to make the final push?
Thank you. That's a good question. I think that we are now, when I look back to the events, not only last half a year or last weekend, but let's say to 2018, We have seen Iran ramping up its uranium enrichment program. It has increased the enrichments from first to 5%, then 20%, then 60%, and then build additional centrifuges, which we don't know where they are, and start these facilities a little bit with the expansion. So I think it's a time to think at whether delaying Iran's nuclear program is anymore a solution, or should one put a stop to this development, which is much harsher step to be taken. It doesn't mean a war, but make such kind of threat or denial to Iran that they think it from, let's say, from economical point of view, from their own people point of view, and decide to stop. But before we get there, Iran has still some ramping up possibilities. Now the highest enrichment is 60%. They can go still to 90% and justify it, for example, more powerful research reactors, which have much higher neutron fluxes. So you make the very compact reactor like the new one which they build now in Isfahan, and use 90% enriched uranium as a fuel. So that is a step which they would think justifying. Whether the international community accepts it, it's another thing. But the denial will be very, very difficult. Delay is easier. Delay is a short-term solution. Denial is a long-term goal. And I think that we have now to think carefully on this next step and put stop on this development. Otherwise, we will regret it, as we did in 2003 with regard of North Korea. People say, no problem, no problem. They just have plutonium. 3 years later, we witnessed a first nuclear test when plutonium turned to be for a warhead. So we cannot afford it in Middle East. We cannot not afford it in Israel. We cannot not afford it globally as well. So this is an important point when you move from real delaying of program to denial of this nuclear weapons capability.
Thank you, Dr. Heinonen. Dr. Arad, I'd like to hear your perspective on this. And to what degree are we in a point where delay should be transformed into a cohesive denial?
Well, the answer, indeed, it is a very vexing question. Question is, do we have a credible, operationable denial option available? It's one thing if we have such a thing, because in that case, maybe it's high time that it be put into effect. But to do that, it should be examined, I think, in the context of the international coalition that had presented itself right now in another denial option, which was to deny the effectiveness of a conventional attack by Iran and Israel. Now we're talking about the denial of the nuclear option to Iran. So it is only, I think, in consultation with the members of that alliance, which is still not a stable alliance and not as organized as it could and should be towards that effect. If it can be brought to a denial option, which is serious, and that may take some time, and we do have that time, then maybe it has to be considered. But what do we do if we do not have that option being an effective one? So then we have to fall back on the delaying tactics, which may be costly, difficult, but and have only limited results. So I don't know exactly what is the state of affairs, but I think the point made is that we should not and could not let it be open-ended, and a credible denial option, which is a preemptive option if carried to the extreme, or some other measures as mentioned, but a credible denial option should be put in place. And therefore, that calls for a possible waiting with the Israeli retaliatory strike that we were conceiving now in order to set the ground for a unified action on the denial option.
Well, I happened to be on the east bank of the Suez Canal on October 22nd, 1973, at 6:52 p.m. This was supposed to be the very moment the ceasefire in the war was to take effect. It later went on for another 2 days. And at that very moment, there was a huge explosion a few kilometers away, and it turned out to have been the first launch of a Scud missile against Israeli forces by Soviet advisors who manned the battery in Egypt. There's a very interesting tale. Foreign Minister Gromyko was away. Defense Minister Grechko authorized it. But in any event, this was the first surface-to-surface missile to have hit Israeli targets. Now, over the last several decades, we have been used to missiles being launched at us by the Iraqis, by Palestinians, by Syrians. It's normal, the new normal. But it's not the new normal when Iran does it, because up to now, it has only been a theoretical exercise. What if, during a crisis, Iran also launches missiles? Now that it has done it, it has broken a taboo between the two nations. Now Israel cannot give Iran the benefit of the doubt, even if Iran becomes officially only a threshold state in the nuclear domain. If that happens, obviously, Israel will have to preempt. Because if you take the scenario which you mentioned earlier of Iran having a nuclear warhead, and we have such a crisis, it is not as if Israel would have waited with its defensive missile against missile system. Israel would have gone ahead and preempt the Iranian missile launchers and its entire defense, including offense array. So in order to de-escalate, Iran must be kept away from that last stage from which it can break out to have nuclear weapons.
Dr. Heinonen, in our extensive conversations together over the years, you always highlighted the various pillars necessary in order to develop a nuclear warhead, payload, and the easiest mechanism in order to monitor progress entails the enrichment process. And within that context, now that even though there are limited observations or monitoring by IAEA agents on the ground in Iran of its various enrichment facilities, there is a growing gap of information that can hardly be mitigated over a short to a medium period of time, and therefore, to what degree in this moment in time is it viable to reach a point of clearly understanding the process or the point in the process where the Iranians find themselves in the race towards a nuclear weapon?
It is a very important step because you need to know and be able to estimate your unknowns. This is the basis for those denials or delays, which the Ara just said. So we need to get a better understanding what did happen with the Ahmad program, how far they really did get. We have to remember that the documents which Israel thankfully picked from Tehran in 2018, that was not the complete picture. They were just those documents which were on those warehouses on those days. There are some other documents. People have been meeting after that under the leadership of Fakhrizadeh, as has been confirmed by Mr. Abbasi Davani. So we need to get to the bottom of that program and find out and mitigate the consequences of unknowns for whatever action will be taken. Whether we deny, whether we delay, we need to be crystal clear where they are with the actual weaponization and how far they have gone with the re-entry vehicles. And to that end, we mentioned the ballistic missiles. I'm not an expert on missiles, but when I look what kind of missiles those were, they were not the best ones which Iran has.
Indeed, some of them may have already been crossing those expiration dates that usually munitions have to take into account. But I'd like to ask Dr. Arad, when we're looking at the climate in the West and the mandate granted to the International Atomic Energy Agency as part of the Board of Governors, there is, or at least seems to be, a lack of support in this point in time with regard to pursuing the open probes that remain about various materials that have been retrieved from Iran from undisclosed locations in breach of both the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, UN Security Council Resolution 2334, or 2231, excuse me, and the various preceding resolutions that were enforced in part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And therefore, I'd like to ask, to what degree can Israel rely on the IAEA at this stage in order to confront or to at least ensure that the Iranians will not break out and reach the ultimate desire of a nuclear weapon?
Whether we can rely, well, in the past, to the extent that there was verification and inspection capacity of satisfactory scope, then that provided some degree of assurance. And when this was complemented by intelligence, and it depends upon its availability, if this could be added to it, then you could have a satisfactory state of affairs as to exactly how far they've gone and how ready they are to effect a certain kind of actions. But I don't know what is the state of affairs now. I would assume with the recent demonstrations of the shortcomings that we've had in our intelligence capacity, that we should be very cautious into assuming that we do possess and might possess more satisfactory position on that. In that being the case, then we have to act upon very high degrees of uncertainty. And if you act on uncertainty, that pushes you into the necessity for some preemptive action. But again, it all depends the extent to which you can improve or you can get into a situation in which you're more confident with what you know. Now, then there is another supposition. The supposition should be that would the Iranians dare to attack us in any condition, in the knowledge that because of uncertainty on our side as to whether this would be a nuclear or not a nuclear attack, Israel would respond under the worst case assumption, which would be detrimental to the Iranians. Are they willing to risk whatever they do on the assumption that we would be cautious in a sense of not taking the more extreme measures? I don't think they would be in such a gambling presupposition. I don't think that they've been gambling in recent weeks when they acted the way they did, even in Lebanon and in Syria. So will they act now or in the future by risking an Israeli reaction which would be not beneficial to them? They have to bend over backwards to demonstrate that there is no threat to Israel that exists within that capacity for us not to elicit an Israeli response, which would be devastating. So it is these kind of considerations that have to be employed. But, this is a very uncomfortable position to be in because so much has to be done in the absence of information with the lack of sufficient certitude and therefore being pushed into the more extreme position just because of that uncertainty.
There are circulating chatter, if I may call it that way, about potentially Iranian having already accumulating a number of nuclear warheads, an assumption that may seem unlikely to practitioners and experts at this point in time. Nevertheless, with a country blatantly striking at, according to ambiguous reports, 4 or maybe even 5 nuclear powers, one may ask the question, how are they so bold?
Well, your question brings us back to the famous 2007 NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate, which President Bush ordered done, but was surprised by the way it was written and presented. And when one reads the unclassified version of it, it is full of reservations. This particular passage is written with high confidence. This is with medium confidence. This is with no confidence. Intelligence agencies, especially after the Iraqi debacle of 2003, are allowed to state unequivocally that there is or there is not weapons of mass destruction material or the weapons themselves. Now, in the 1980s, a former SAVAK chief who immigrated from Iran, he was close to the Shah and then he went to the States. He wrote a book about Iran. And he said that Khomeini, who was in exile for 16 years in Iraq and then in France, was so ignorant of what is happening in the world that he believed that Carter was not the name of the president. Carter was the title of an American president. So there is a Carter. Carter is a Carter Reagan and so on and so forth. Of course, Khamenei is not so ignorant. And Khamenei knows that in 7 months' time, there will be elections in the United States. And the prospect of Donald Trump coming back to the White House is very real. He may not be elected, but he may very well be. Does that mean that the Iranians tried to break out now, before the elections? Are they waiting for the transition between November and January? Are they waiting for the next president? This, too, is a consideration that we have to keep in mind.
With all the information available to us in the public domain, as well as other sources, Dr. Heinonen, what is the period of time necessary for the Iranians to make such a breakout? And would a test be necessary? Couldn't they just announce, like the Americans who have not tested before the strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well, they did once, Alamogordo.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did, but not for the uranium weapon, but that was much simpler in design. So that was the first time when it was dropped. Yes, these are difficult questions, and it depends also pretty much on how much they have got foreign support for their weapon design. We saw that there was this Russian gentleman, which I had the pleasure to talk with at one point of time, who helped them, but who were the others? Because I understood from a conversation with these Ukrainian people who had been in Tehran that there were other Russians involved as well. So these are the questions which we need to find out and to see how far they got. And this is why I think we are now in a very precarious situation, because they have so close to the breakout. We don't know real design and capabilities and unhold locations, and there are a lot of changes politically globally in the world. Iran does very well at calibration so far, but you may calibrate wrongly. Or as one of the Iranian negotiators one time said to me that, or actually to someone else, that when he said that they are playing this game like a chess. So the ambassador said, no, we are also playing poker.
Indeed. Dr. Arad, we have roughly 1.5 minutes. What should Israel do or consider to do in the near to immediate future?
Well, engage in very fast rethinking of the situation trying to assess as best as one can what is the exact state of affairs. Even the breakout thing has many forms to it, and we have to look at the totality and as to the extent of how much of this is actionable in terms of use and in what capacity. And all these are details which should be discussed very thoroughly by all those who have an equal interest in not having Iran getting to that point of having nuclear weapons, and then take some positions. But the positions also have to remember that the big hedging strategy that had been used in this case was that it is in everybody's interest to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. But should that fail as a result of bad luck, bad management, surprise, or anything, then our immediate posture would be one of effective deterrence. And if you have effective deterrence, then this can also have some degree of capacity to prevent the worst from happening. So the question is, what are we to do to provide even now a deterrence against moving ahead with a nuclear program? And then what do we have to have in place in form of deterrence should they have such a program? Now, on all these, we have to act simultaneously with a sense of urgency. And this is what I suggest be done. If it is done effectively, and if we pool our resources, I'm not petrified even by the option that they might have nuclear weapons, because, again, we were supposed ready to put in place a policy that would make sure, as much as you can, that there would be no use. And I am of the view that the Iranians, even when prone to so many things, are not beyond calculating what's in their best interest. But all this has to be done very rapidly, and it is vital that it be done, because on the different responses, we may get different policies that we have to pursue, one of which may be an earlier than expected preemptive strike.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Mr. Oren, Dr. Heinonen, as well as Dr. Arad, and to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.